I was kicked out of my home when I was 20 years old, and when my golden brother got into trouble, they wanted to come back to me. I used to believe that a mother's love was unconditional. That no matter what, a mother would always love her child equally, fiercely, protectively. But life has a way of erasing childhood illusions. I was 20 years old the day my mother told me to leave. "You'll be fine, David," she said, arms crossed over her chest, her voice filled with the same indifference I'd grown used to. "You're a grown man now. It's time to make your own way." Her words should have been reassuring, supportive even, but I knew better. She wasn't encouraging me, she was discarding me. My older brother, James, sat on the couch behind her, watching in silence. He didn't need to say anything. He had always been the golden child, the favorite. He had their love, their support, their unwavering faith. And I? I was the inconvenience. The extra mouth to feed. The shadow that never quite measured up to the light that was James. I had spent my entire childhood trying to earn my mother's affection. Straight A's, sports, part-time jobs, none of it mattered. James could skip school, crash cars, waste money, and she would still beam at him with the kind of love I had never known. And now, she was pushing me out of the house without a second thought. I packed my things in a single duffel bag, my hands shaking. No tears were shed on my behalf, no parting words of kindness. Just a simple, cold dismissal. I stood at the door for a moment, waiting. Hoping, maybe, that she'd change her mind. That James would say something, anything, in my defense. But he just leaned back against the couch, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. And so, with no money, no home, and no family, I stepped out into the world alone. The years that followed were brutal. At first, I crashed on friends' couches, took whatever odd jobs I could find, and tried to figure out how to survive. The nights were the worst, lying awake in someone's spare room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my own mother could toss me aside so easily. There were times I thought about going back. Begging, even. But I knew better. Instead, I worked harder than I ever had. I worked construction by day and waited tables by night. I took college classes when I could afford them, teaching myself everything I could about business, finance, and investments. I refused to be nothing. I refused to let her be right about me. By the time I was 28, I had built something of my own. A small real estate company, growing steadily, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, but I had finally carved out a place for myself in a world that had never wanted me. And then, fate decided to be cruel. Because after years of silence, my mother called me. "David," she said, her voice suddenly warm, too warm. "It's been so long. We've missed you." I almost laughed. We should have a family dinner," she continued, as if she hadn't exiled me years ago. "James has been struggling lately. Work has been tough. And, well, the house isn't what it used to be." Ah. There it was. They didn't miss me. They missed what I had become. I let her talk, let her spin a web of false nostalgia, let her tell me how much she regretted losing touch. And when she finally got to the point, when she asked if I could help out, if I could support family in their time of need, I smiled. A real, genuine smile. Because for the first time in my life, I had all the power. I took a breath, savoring the moment, then said, "I'll think about it, Mom." And I did. Oh, I thought about it a lot. But if she thought for 1 second that I would be the same desperate boy standing in that doorway, waiting for her love, she had no idea who I had become. A week after my mother's unexpected call, I received another one. This time, it was James. "David," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "it's been too long, man. We should catch up." I leaned back in my office chair, glancing out the window of my downtown high-rise. The city stretched before me, a testament to everything I had built without them. Without their love, their support, their belief in me. "I'm surprised you remember I exist," I said, keeping my tone light. James chuckled, like this was all some big misunderstanding. "Come on, don't be like that. We were kids back then. Let's put the past behind us." The past. The past where he watched me get thrown out like garbage. The past where he stayed in that house, living comfortably while I spent years clawing my way up from nothing. I should have hung up right then and there. But instead, I played along. "Sure," I said. Let's meet up. We met at a high-end restaurant, one of the best in the city. The kind of place James would have never been able to afford on his own. He walked in wearing a designer suit, but I could tell right away that it wasn't new. His once polished confidence had dulled. His smile was forced, his eyes tired. I, on the other hand, had never looked better. My suit was tailored. My watch was worth more than the car James had crashed in high school. The hostess greeted me by name. James noticed. "You're doing well for yourself," he said as he sat across from me. I simply smiled. "So," I said, getting straight to the point. "What's this really about?" James exhaled heavily. "Mom told you, didn't she? Things have been rough. Work's been slow. The house needs repairs. And, well, Mom's getting older." He looked at me then, the way he used to when we were kids. The way he used to when he needed something. "She won't say it outright, but she needs help, David. You know how stubborn she is. She'd never ask for money directly, but," he spread his hands. "You have the means. And at the end of the day, we're still family." Family. That word should have meant something. But coming from him, it was nothing more than a manipulation. "Tell me something, James," I said, swirling the whiskey in my glass. "Where was this family when I had nowhere to sleep? When I was working 18-hour days just to afford a meal?" James shifted in his seat. "That was a long time ago. Things were different. Not for me." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Look, I get it. You're still bitter." I laughed. A sharp, genuine laugh. "Bitter? James, I'm not bitter. I'm successful. There's a difference." He clenched his jaw, the mask slipping for just a second. He hated this. Hated that I wasn't the struggling little brother he could look down on. But he wasn't done yet. "David," he said, lowering his voice. "Mom needs us. If you don't help, she could lose the house." "Ah." And there it was. "You mean your house?" James stiffened. "She put it in your name, didn't she?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. Of course. She had given everything to him, just as she always had. And now, when things weren't going well, they had the audacity to come crawling back to me. I took a slow sip of my drink before setting it down. "I'll think about it," I said, echoing the same words I had told my mother. James brightened slightly, thinking he had won. "Thanks, man. I knew you wouldn't turn your back on us." I just smiled. He had no idea. That weekend, I went back. I pulled up to the house, the same house I had been thrown out of a decade ago. It looked smaller now. Weaker. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown, the roof sagging from years of neglect. James and my mother were waiting for me on the porch, forced smiles plastered onto their faces. "David," my mother called out, arms open like she actually expected a hug. I didn't move. She faltered, dropping her hands. "Well, come inside," she said, clearing her throat. "It's still your home, after all." I stepped inside, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a relic of a past I had long since buried. We sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. My mother launched into a rehearsed speech about family, about forgiveness, about how she regretted what had happened. James sat beside her, nodding along, playing the role of the devoted son. And then, finally, she got to the point. "The house is in trouble," she admitted. "We've fallen behind on payments. The repairs," she sighed dramatically. "It's more than we can handle. We just need a little help, David. Just until we get back on our feet." She clasped her hands together, eyes pleading. I let the silence stretch between us before finally speaking. "You want my money?" She flinched. "I wouldn't put it that way." "How else would you put it?" I asked, leaning forward. "Because let's be honest, Mom. You didn't call me because you missed me. You didn't invite me back because you wanted to fix things. You called me because I have something you need." Her lips pressed into a thin line. James, ever the diplomat, tried again. "David, we just thought." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Let me ask you something. If the roles were reversed, if I had been the one struggling, would you have helped me?" Neither of them spoke. I nodded, already knowing the answer. That's what I thought. My mother sighed, shaking her head. I knew this was a mistake. You're still holding a grudge. No, Mom, I said, standing. I'm just finally playing by your rules. I pulled out a folder from my coat pocket and tossed it onto the coffee table. James frowned. What's this? The foreclosure notice. Their eyes widened in horror. You're behind on more than just repairs, I said, tilting my head. The bank is ready to take this place. And since James is the official owner, well, let's just say he's in quite a bit of debt. James lunged for the papers, flipping through them. His face paled. How did you get these? He demanded. I smiled. Let's just say I have connections. My mother shot to her feet. You can't do this, David. This is our home. No, Mom. It's his home. I pointed at James. You made that clear when you gave it to him instead of me. She sputtered, searching for words. James looked at me, fury burning in his eyes. You think this is funny? I shrugged. I think it's justice. I turned toward the door. Oh, and one more thing, I said over my shoulder. The house goes up for auction next month. I've already placed the highest bid. James shot up. You wouldn't. I met his gaze, unflinching. Watch me. And with that, I walked out. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being left behind. They were. The day of the auction arrived faster than I expected. James had called me 3 times that morning, each voicemail more frantic than the last. My mother, on the other hand, had given up on persuasion and gone straight to guilt-tripping. How could you do this to your own family, David? After everything we've been through? I let her message play in the background as I adjusted my tie in the mirror. The words had no effect on me anymore. They weren't asking me for help. They were demanding it. For years, I had been the outsider, the forgotten one. Now, I held all the cards. And I wasn't about to fold. The auction was held in a small conference room at the county courthouse. The moment I stepped inside, I spotted James in the back, pacing like a caged animal. My mother sat beside him, wringing her hands. I took my seat near the front, not acknowledging them. I wasn't here for a family reunion. The auctioneer started reading out the details of the property. James's foot tapped rapidly against the floor. He kept glancing at me, probably hoping I'd turn around, maybe reconsider. I didn't. Bidding began. A few investors threw in initial offers, but none of them were truly interested. They were here for a good deal, not a house that needed extensive repairs. Then it was my turn. I raised my hand, stating my bid clearly. Silence. The auctioneer looked around the room, waiting for someone to counter. No one did. James leaned forward, whispering furiously to my mother. But there was nothing they could do. I had already won. Sold. After the papers were signed and the house was officially mine, I walked past James and my mother without stopping. James, however, wasn't ready to let it go. David, he called, grabbing my arm. I turned, meeting his desperate gaze. You got what you wanted, he said, his voice shaking. Now what? You're going to let Mom be homeless? You're going to kick us out onto the streets? I stared at him for a moment, then slowly smiled. That's not my problem, I said, repeating the exact words Piper had said to me when she locked me out of my own house years ago. James's face twisted in fury. You're a real piece of work, you know that, he spat. I shrugged. I learned from the best. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. David, please. Don't do this. I looked at her, really looked at her. For years, I had wanted her to see me. To acknowledge me. To love me the way she had always loved James. But I realized now, she never would. And that was okay. Because I didn't need her love anymore. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my pocket and handed it to her. She took it with shaking hands, unfolding it slowly. It was a rental agreement. The house belongs to me now, I said calmly. If you want to stay, you can. But you'll pay rent, just like any other tenant. James scoffed. You can't be serious. I raised an eyebrow. If you don't like the terms, feel free to find another place. My mother's lips trembled as she read through the document. The rent was fair, lower than what they'd find anywhere else in the city. I wasn't doing this to punish them. I was doing this to make a point. I wouldn't be used again. James grabbed the paper from her hands, crumpling it. "You're pathetic," he hissed. "You think this makes you better than us?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "No, James. The difference is, I earned everything I have. You expected it to be handed to you." He had nothing left to say. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there with nothing but the consequences of their own actions. A month later, I checked my mailbox and found a rent check with my mother's signature at the bottom. James had left. But she had stayed. And for the first time in my life, I knew, I wasn't the one who had lost. They were. Owning the house felt different than I expected. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about proving a point. It was just business. My mother had signed the rental agreement. She had no other choice. James, predictably, had stormed off, blaming me for his misfortune rather than facing the reality that he had squandered every opportunity he'd ever been given. But my mother, she stayed. She paid her rent on time, never late, never missing a month. And for the first time in my life, she had no choice but to acknowledge me. I visited the house a few weeks after she moved back in. I wanted to see it with fresh eyes, not as the place I was thrown out of, but as my property. The moment she opened the door, I saw it in her face. The discomfort. The realization that the power dynamic had shifted forever. She wasn't the mother holding all the cards anymore. She wasn't the one making the rules. I was. "You're here to check on the house?" she asked, stepping aside. "That's right." I walked in, noting the repairs I'd started. New flooring, a fresh coat of paint, better appliances. I had no sentimental attachment to this place anymore. It was an asset, nothing more. But my mother, she was struggling to see it that way. As I inspected the kitchen, she finally broke the silence. "I didn't want to throw you out, you know," she said quietly. I set down my paperwork, glancing at her. "But you did." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I was scared. You were always so independent." James, he needed me. I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "No, Mom. He needed a crutch. And you gave it to him. You let him sink because you never made him learn how to swim." She swallowed hard. I thought I was doing the right thing. I shook my head. "No, you did what was easy. You didn't want to deal with me. So you pushed me out and convinced yourself it was for my own good." Silence stretched between us. For the first time, I saw her as something other than a mother. She was just a woman. A flawed, scared, aging woman who had made her choices. And now, she had to live with them. "You're a good man, David," she said at last, her voice breaking. I smiled, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. "I know." A year passed. James never came back. My mother stayed in the house, paying her rent without complaint. I visited occasionally, checking in, not on her, but on the investment. It was business. Nothing more. One day, I got a call. It was James. "Hey," he said, his voice unfamiliar after all this time. I stayed silent, waiting. I heard you're doing well." I smirked. "You heard right." He exhaled heavily. "Look. I messed up." I leaned back in my chair, tapping my pen against the desk. "Yeah. You did." Another silence. "I want to fix things," he said. "Maybe we could." I didn't let him finish. "James." "Yeah. I'm busy." And then I hung up. Because I had nothing left to prove. I had one. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need their validation. I had built my own future. And this time, I wasn't looking back. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.